TCKid. Welcome to TCKid Talks, an interview series featuring movers and shakers from the third culture and cross-cultural community. Today we have as our guest Ruth Van Reken, co-author of Third Culture Kid, Growing Up Among Worlds, originally published as The Third Culture Experience in 1999. And we have a special appearance by Michael Pollock, son of co-author Dave Pollock. Erin, would you like to introduce our guest today?
Sure thing. All right, so Ruth Van Reken is a U.S. citizen who grew up in Nigeria as a second-generation third culture kid and raised her 3 daughters in Liberia. Ruth is the co-author of Third Culture Kids, Growing Up Among Worlds, and the author of Letters Never Sent, her personal journal written as she sought to understand the long-term impact of her cross-cultural childhood. For nearly 30 years, Ruth has traveled extensively both nationally and internationally, speaking about issues related to global family lifestyles. Currently, she is seeking to understand how lessons learned from the TCK experience can transfer to others raised among many cultural worlds for various reasons. She is co-founder and past chairperson of the annual Families in Global Transition Conference, and in addition to her 2 books, she has written a chapter in Strangers at Home, Unrooted Childhoods, and Writing Out of Limbo, as well as other writings. We also have Michael Pollock joining us today. Mike is an educator and trainer with a passion for third culture and cross-cultural kids. Mike grew up as a pastor's kid and a missionary's kid between the U.S. and Kenya, and has worked short-term in South Africa, England, and Kenya. He and his wife, an MK from Sierra Leone, have raised their children in the U.S. and China. With a background in education from Houghton College and Loyola University, Mike was a founding head of school for Cambridge School in Baltimore and founded and directed Odyssey, a student development initiative for 6 international schools in China. He is also the son of researcher, author, and speaker David Pollock. His most recent work is Daraja, which means bridge in Swahili. Daraja is an organization whose vision is to encourage and equip young adult TCKs and CCKs as they transition through the college years by offering gap year or semester opportunities for reflection, renewal, leadership formation, and direction.
And I'd like to, Erin, I know you're in Manila, Philippines, and I'm in San Antonio, Texas, for those of you just tuning in. And Ruth and Michael, I just wanted to start off with where you are and also how you came to discover that you are a third culture kid.
Thanks, Myra, and thanks, Erin. It's really, really fun to be here with you and to be in this community of people that you have gathered from so far around. I'm in Indianapolis, and I was living in Liberia when I first heard that I was a TC kid, someone who had come from one culture, gone to another culture, and grew up in that world that is shared with others who are doing a similar experience. I was in Liberia, and I went to the mailbox one day, and as I began writing in the first foreword to the first edition of TCKid book, said, you know, some days there is a moment that changes your life forever, and you didn't even know it was coming. And I went to the mailbox, I opened the mail, there was a letter from my mother. In it, she had put an article, and it just said Third Culture Kid at the top, and it was written by David Pollock. Never heard of the term. I thought my mother was sending it because we were living in Africa, and maybe it was something about third world or something, and you know, why would she send it? But since my mom sent it, I thought I should read it, and so I could comment on it. So as I started reading it, I thought, oh my goodness, this sounds like me, because it was talking about some of the feelings people had when they lived in this world among worlds where there's so many paradoxes, and we'll be talking more about that. But that was the first time that I had ever heard the term, and that I had any awareness that there was language from my experience. How about you, Mike?
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm calling in from Muskegon, Michigan. It's a new home. Been here about 2 months, and so loving that. And I'm really honored to be here among these great folks. This way. My understanding of being a TCK was more of a slow dawning experience as my family returned from Kenya, and my dad, after working with MKs and TCKs in Kenya, began to work with with TCKs coming back from overseas with reentry seminars. I think that was probably the first, and then realizing that some of our experiences, I think he was still in still in that learning mode. What does this mean? What are the implications? And so as the pieces began to come together, I think it was a slow dawning. We began to hear about Dr. Ruth Van Reken. We got to meet folks in global nomads, and that the name that should be on the tip of my tongue just slipped my mind. Yes.
Norma McCaig.
Norma McCaig, yes. And so I think it was really a process over time that was saying, oh, we're like others. And I did go to I went to a reentry seminar. We returned to the States I was about 12, and at about 16, I went to a reentry seminar, and there was that eye-opening time of recognizing my tribe. And so that was kind of the dawning for me.
So interesting. And I know for me, and Aaron, I want you to share your story too. For me, it was just I learned the term when I was speaking to someone, and someone else actually had known, a work colleague of mine had already known the term before I did, before I even know that I was a third culture kid myself. And so that led me to a Google search, and then I ended up on TCKid.com. And then, the rest is history. But it's just so interesting how we all have such a common experience that whether we know it or not, so many other people around the world, no matter where they started off with, whether they started off as a missionary kid or a child of a foreign service diplomat or someone, with a parents in multinational corporates that have, branches all over the world, or any other category, we all have such a common experience. And before Erin shares her story of how she discovered she was a third culture kid, I also just want to give a special appreciation to those of you out there who don't consider themselves third culture kid or are just tuning in just to find out more. And we just welcome you to just listen to our stories as we share them. Erin?
Well, what's interesting about me was that, I learned the term third culture kid when I was maybe 14 or 15, when I was still in high school. And I knew what it meant, and I knew on some very theoretical level that it was something that I could relate to. But I was attending an international school, and I just assumed, oh, everybody here is like that. And it didn't actually dawn on me until I left that environment and I was back in the world of, people who aren't all TCKs, and where it's not normal for people to be globally mobile. So it really hit me then that, like, oh, this is what it means to be different, and this is why this resonates with me, why this is relevant to me and my experiences. And so that was really, college specifically, it was when I started exploring that in more depth. So I was really glad that it was there, and that I, eventually, with social media becoming so popular, we had a venue to meet other people who were like ourselves and going through that same sort of journey of exploring what it all meant and why it means something. So it was really, really good to have that.
Thank you, Erin, for your story. For those of us who did discover that we were just a third culture kid, we've always had the Third Culture Kid book as a process of our discovery and finding out more about who we are and what we could do to navigate our experiences as a third culture kid or cross-culture kid. And Ruth and Michael, could you tell us a bit about how the book came about? And especially, Ruth, I want to ask you, how was the world like before this book? Because a lot of us who are watching today, me and Erin, we just can't imagine the process of finding out that we're a third culture kid and that whole journey that we're still in without the book being there.
Thanks, Ira. We were talking about this in the practice session. I realized I'm almost prehistoric, and that kind of hit me. I thought, oh my goodness, the world really has changed. But because I am quite old now. But before even saying that, I want to make one comment on all the stories we've heard. I think that there's this process of development that goes along with the discovery of who you are as a TCK. And an awful lot of kids, it's very common in high school where kids don't even want to hear the term or own the term because they feel like it's somebody trying to tell them something, defining them in a way that they may not yet want to be or discover. When I heard the term, I had already lived it and lived through the responses, and so it was like an aha moment, like, oh, this is describing me. And I think sometimes for younger people, they feel like somebody's trying to define them, so it can take a while. And that's okay. We can give the journey, and sometimes parents need to kind of hold it inside that this is what I'm watching without real, maybe giving the kid all the language and terms and so forth. Because before anything else, we never can forget we're people. And but anyway, let's go back. This was 1984 for me, that I first got that letter. And I was 39 years old at the time. I had lived my life, as you said, growing up in Nigeria. When I came back to the States, I did reentry, but I had no idea that I was doing reentry. All I knew was I was the weirdest thing that ever hit the planet, that everybody else knew how to function, and I didn't know how to skate. I didn't know American football, and the skill sets that I had, I could play soccer, but nobody was playing soccer in America then. I could bargain and market like crazy, but who cared, So everything I had learned how to do and felt normal as a person just didn't have any place in Chicago. But of course, people didn't see that about me. They saw me as this person that was pre-integration, and that everybody looked like, I looked like the other kids in my class. So that was a really, really hard year, and I determined I would never let anybody know I was from Africa when I started high school, and just try and be like everybody else. So that was my journey. I had no language, I had no understanding. I just kept thinking, what is the matter with me? And keeping that my little secret, but that was my internal place. Then I went on to, do you want to say something?
And we'll talk more about that, which is a very common experience, and how you talk about how it's important to name your experience, because when we don't recognize it, it blinds us from a whole world of processing our past and going through a journey. I'm sorry, continue.
No, please break in anytime. And it also keeps us from processing it in the present. If I had had some understanding that what I was experiencing was normal, then you can forgive yourself. You can try and figure out, okay, what am I going to do with this? Anyway, so we had no language. We had no comprehension. It was like a secret world. And I think that's what I found out with so many people of my generation. We all live this secret. In fact, John McCain is a TCK, and if you really go on a website, you can't find out much about his childhood. It's like it was all kind of hidden, and I thought he was my generation. We didn't know what to do with our story, is essentially. I mean, he says he's a military kid, but you don't know the details. And so anyway, life went on, and then I did go through a depression later on, as I'll talk about in a bit, because I couldn't understand where all these things were coming from. But anyway, eventually I was in Liberia, and again, we had no understanding, but I got that letter from my mother, and that was the time I was also beginning to do my journal and trying to put words on my story, which you alluded to, we'll talk about in more detail. But in the middle of that process, I got this survey that I was supposed to fill out for my children. And it was from Dave Pollock, and he was going to have the first international conference on missionary kids in the Philippines. So, Aaron, your city of Manila there is the star event that we had at the beginning, and that's where we were. And I was supposed to fill it out. Well, I filled it out for my kids. Then I wrote them a note, and I said, what are you doing for the adult third culture kids? Because I'm 39, nobody ever had a reentry seminar, nobody ever processed, and here I am trying to figure out my story, and you're going to have a conference, and I still don't say anything for the older people. So Dave, in great kindness, wrote back to me, and he said, no. I said, then I'll send you my stuff if you want, maybe it'll help. So he wanted to see it. He wrote back, and all sorts of things happened, but bottom line, I wound up at the conference and met Dave in person, and that began a great friendship. And Dave's gift was synthesizing and listening to people's stories and putting them together. And so through him, I met Norma McCaig at the second conference, and she was the first person to really say this is cross-sector. This transcends each specific group of people. So then, as we were going along, I kept saying to Dave, you've got to write your stuff, because he was going around the world, going to many schools, doing reentry seminars, and people were starting to pick it up, and I said, you have to write. And then he said, I don't have time. So I heard myself say, well, then I'll help you. And I just thought, how hard could it be? It's a little profile and transition. And so I began trying to help with that, and then the editor said, well, you have to explain it. Why does it happen? I thought, well, I don't know. So it became a 7-year process, and that's how the book started. Any questions you can ask me, but that's how it started.
And the book, it has such a great wealth of information. Like I said earlier, it's so hard for many of us to imagine this journey without the book, especially the section on raft and how to build, how to make those transitions. Raft standing for reconciliation, affirmation, farewells, and think destination as a way to sort of prepare for a transition from one place to another. Ruth, can you tell us a bit about who else this book is valuable for other than TCKs?
Right, and I want to make one comment there that the RAFT was definitely Dave's acronym, and he was probably one of the first people in the world to develop a whole series of seminars on the transition process. And I think that as people read that, no matter what their story is, everybody does transition. You do transition at different stages in life, as Dave always said. You do transition, from college and all that. So that part is universal. I think, though, that the pieces that are particularly, I hope, helpful to the others in the update, we have also added a chapter on other kinds of cross-cultural upbringings. Because no matter where we were going in the world, even from the beginning, I know people always said to Dave Pollock as well as to me, that, well, I didn't do the experience your way, but I have that sense that people don't know who I really am. When they look at me, they don't know my story because of all sorts of things. So what I am hoping is by adding a section there on immigrants and refugees and people who go to school in a different culture, minorities, domestic TCKs, all these other ways people grow up, biculturally, mixed race, that we can start a unified discussion about what are some of the impacts of growing up cross-culturally, no matter how you do it. And I know Dave was working with refugees before he died. And Mike, I don't know, you've got other thoughts you've been working out there. What do you think?
Yeah, I think some of this will be topic of the next interview that we do, because it's a big one. But I was just reading some material last night on immigration law in the U.S. Some that my daughter's a senior at Taylor sent to me, and I believe that there is this cross-sector piece and things that we've learned, and that maybe began in the MK community, moving on, the greater, broader TCK community, and now including a globe on the move, really, people moving everywhere. Sometimes, sometimes by their decision, and many times because of war, or famine, or political instability, or whatever. And I do believe that there are some truths and some tools, some equipping that is very applicable and very useful across. I happen to think that TCKs have a special place in this new global reality, that to take initiative with the gifts that they've been given for powerful impact. That's one of my passions.
Yes,
Great.
and we all have heard of Ted Ward's description of third culture kids being the prototype citizens of the future. And I think what's also helped is Pico Iyer's talk on TED Talks, TED Global, where he described that whole process of finding where is home. How do we define where is home? And it's so interesting. And for those of you who haven't seen it yet, and I know many of us have, but it's interesting to watch. He has a talk called Where is Home? And I just also want to share that Dr. Paulette Bethel has a very informative and helpful series of interviews called the Lost in Transition Global Telesummit. And you can find more information on that on Transitions. I believe it's transformationseries.com. Transformationseries.com. And both Ruth Van Reken and I have been on that show. And listening to the other guests like Rahul Gandatra, it's so interesting to hear all the stories. I learned something about Kobe Bryant that I didn't even know because I was listening to Rahul and Dr. Bethel and Havala talk about third culture kids and reveal more about third culture kids. For the audience, I do want to share that we have a special request from the audience to be involved in this whole process of helping others find out more about third culture kids that we'll ask of you at the end. Ruth, do you have any insights? And I know you shared some of it in Dr. Bethel's series also, but do you have any new insights since the last revision of the book?
Well, I think that one of the things that's been increasingly I'm more aware of is the impact of language. I mean, that maybe sounds kind of basic, but when we did our cultural identity box, where if you're a foreigner, if you don't look like someone and you don't think like someone, your identity is clear, and so how you relate is clear. And then, of course, the whole issue of being a hidden immigrant, where you may look like the dominant culture, but you may not think like them, which is certainly what many of us have at reentry, or are adopted. You may look different, but you think more like the dominant, and people don't expect you to be like them, or a mirror where you're just alike. People have said to me, and I think it's absolutely true, they said I need to add language there, because sometimes how you speak can identify you or surprise people. And so that's been an interesting thing, the whole issue of how bilingualism is important. There's so many new studies on that. But I think the other thing that is a growing awareness of mine that isn't finished thinking, because I do want to say we need everybody's minds, because this is an evolving process and a growing dynamic that's happening in our world, is that even in the international schools, while we can look really diverse, I'm hearing from some that when I go to the school, I have to be very Western, and people don't know who I am when we go home. So maybe we need to become more aware of the differences, even for a lot of kids in international school, between their home culture and their school culture. And these are all things that I keep growing and keep thinking about, but even back to where these topics apply, I've really become aware how, even for immigrants and immigrant children, many of these topics are very relevant, because in today's world, unlike 50 years ago, so many kids go back and forth between their parents' culture, their grandparents, where their grandparents are, and wherever they're living. And when they go back, they are also in that hidden immigrant category, because they go back and people wonder, how can you be a Kenyan or an Indian or a Chinese or whatever, and you don't behave that way after you're coming here. So all of these things are all evolving, and they're wonderful things to think about, how we use our gifts in the global workplace. Just everything is it feels like we barely got started. There's so much to still think about. That's why we need your generation.
And continue to pass the torch, right?
We're trying.
And
mine's getting dim.
Yeah, and you're right. Everything is changing. I remember you were talking about on Dr. Bethel's show how, because the world is becoming more globalized, the work that we had to do, or you all had to do maybe 20 years ago, is different. It looks different from what the work we have to do today. And
Right.
I know back in your day, before the book came out, there was no Skype, there was no Facebook or anything, and so communication was different. I remember listening to my parents' stories of how they used to part, from one another, how they used to bid farewell, and it involved them being on ships, and one person on the ship throwing a long ribbon that's supposed to land on the ground of where the ones watching them leave are supposed to catch. And then as the ship slowly drifts out, then you're supposed to hold the both ends of the string, or one person holds one end of the string and the other one the other, as you bid farewell. And then the whole ride on the ship is a completely longer process than just going on a plane, showing your boarding pass, sitting there for maybe 2 to 6 hours, and then leaving the plane with your boarding, with your luggage and going home, maybe within a day, if you're traveling internationally, within 24 hours usually. And so even our whole perspective on transition and leaving and arriving is different from when it was 20, 30 years ago. One very helpful chapter in Third Culture Kid.
Can I make one comment on that?
Sure.
I just want to say I do feel like we're in TCKid phase 2, because it's kind of like the basic understanding is there. Now, what do we do with it? And what you guys have done with it is phenomenal. I want to thank Bryce Royer and all of you who followed in his footsteps, because you've made it available to the world. Dave Pollock worked his tail off, and Mike can tell you more about that in his interview in another day. I think he will. He went around the world physically every year, school by school, trying to get the topic going. People didn't believe in it then. It took a long time, but it's a very labor-intensive way to do it. One day somebody sent me a link to something called TCKid.com, wondered if I'd ever seen it, and I couldn't believe it. Here this was, on the social media, on the network, and what do you got, 21,000 people or more just on your site? And
including Facebook groups.
Yeah, you have taken it to that place where the common person knows it. That couldn't happen without what you guys do. And I want to thank you for that, but also that's part of the change, that the information has become more available. And you guys are key people, and Bryce, if you're listening, I want to thank you too, because you had a vision and you've done it.
Thank you, Bryce.
Thank you, Myra and Aaron and everybody else.
Thank you. And
Myra,
thank you, Dave Pollock. Oh, sure.
Oh, I just wanted to add, when you made the list of things that didn't exist, you didn't mention email.
Yes.
Just thinking about the fact that we, when I first, so it was even more so, but Ruth and I probably both remember the blue air forms that took.
Absolutely.
They were the speediest little fold-up light, paper letters, and they would take 2 weeks there, 2 weeks back. So the fastest, if you unless you can get through by phone, which was sketchy in a lot of places, the fastest was 4 weeks for communication. When email came out, it was just this amazing way to connect and reconnect across miles, and it was affordable.
I went 4 years. I didn't talk to my parents once, because there was no phone connection. And even these little blue air forms, by the time I sent them and they answered me, I couldn't even remember what wonderful problem I'd had that I'd even written them about. Right. So it was a big deal. Right. But anyway, you guys are making it happen now for everybody.
I use that too, the par avion.
Yeah.
And I do remember. And actually, back when I was in high school, what my friends and I used to do, and it was a ritual. It was a ritual for me to be able to deal with the homesickness and missing my friends, because a lot of people who didn't live this lifestyle don't realize that you're constantly on the move. This didn't happen when you're a teenager and you're on vacation. This is what it was from year to year, or maybe every 2 or 3 years. And what my friends and I used to do as part of our ritual for dealing with missing each other was we would make cassette tapes of each other, because long-distance phone calls were too expensive. We would make cassette tapes of us just recording how our day was, and updates, and high school gossip, and we even recorded segments of our favorite comedians that we used to listen to when we were all together in the same city, and send that, and it would be really creative. And not to say that social media isn't creative now, but back in the day, you had to be super creative to keep in touch, you know, and be able to share your emotion in letters and on cassette tapes or other forms where Skype and Facebook now do. And so actually what we're all doing is naming our experiences as a third culture kid. What I just did was naming my experience of how it was for me missing my friends, and for me, that's why for me one of the most important sections in this book was that section on what can adult third culture kids do. And for those who have this edition, it's on page 251. What ATCKs, adult third culture kids, can do, and it's under the chapter of It's Never Too Late. And there's a lot of other valuable information in that chapter about how you know, parents can help. But the naming our experiences, which includes naming our behavioral patterns, naming fears, naming our losses, wounds, and our choices. This you know, as you put in the book, Ruth, it's a process of simply putting a name to our past. And for me, Letters Never Sent is also a journey of that. You know, your experience as a missionary kid in the past. Get more into Letters Never Sent a little bit later because there's valuable information in this too. It's very emotional, but for anyone who took the challenge to read this book and go through the emotions while reading this book, you all would agree that it's valuable information because it talks about the human experience of the loss in a very raw form, in a very creative form, because it's almost like we're reading her journal. And but before we go into that book, and in a little while, I want to open up the lines. I believe on YouTube there is a section on the right side where you can submit comments or questions. We want to be able to take comments or questions from our live audience about how the chapter on naming our losses or naming your losses, your experiences, has impacted your life. But while we're doing that, Ruth, I wanted to ask, why is it so important to be able to name our experiences? Why is that so effective?
I think that language and having a name for something empowers me to be able to work with it. It says the truth will set you free. And if I don't even know what I'm feeling, if I can't put a name on it, all I can do is feel it and react to it. I have no way to make a choice about what I'm going to do with this. And for me, the story really was, I had this place that I had this incredibly wonderful life. I loved my life as a child. I loved growing up in Nigeria. It was wonderful. And I loved all the people I met. Then, as I said, I went back to the States. I had that bad year. Then I, sort of got even keeled. But later on, we went back when David, my husband, was a senior in medical school. We went back to Africa, and it was my first time back in 12 years. And I think this world I had shut away, when I look back at it now, kind of popped up again. But of course, I didn't know what to do with it. We went back to the States. We moved to St. Louis. Dave was an intern. He was gone every other night. And I think when I think about my life, I always took care of any pain or grief by staying terribly busy. Now we were in a new place. I had a new baby. I didn't have any friends. Long distance was very expensive. For the first time in my entire life, I got depressed. I couldn't understand it because I've never thought of myself as a depressive person. So that was, I still didn't have language. I got angry easy. I got depressed. I didn't understand. And that was a process of again, I didn't even go to a therapist because I don't know, I guess I was proud or something. But we moved and we went in the Navy and life got better and I thought, okay, I'm fine. But then when my daughter was going to leave, all these feelings came back and I thought, okay, this is one of the secrets, guys. When you have feelings that you don't have any understanding, because in my brain, I had no reason for it. I had a good husband. I had 3 children I loved my life. What is this place? Something's going on that connects to something else. But I couldn't work with it until I could figure it out. So I finally thought it must have something to do with my leaving. And that was when I began to write Letters Never Sent, just totally as a journal. And suddenly I realized that there was this world of losses, and that I'd lost, my family, I'd lost my world, and that even though I'd had this wonderful life, there were some very specific places of loss. And I think this is one of the big, big, big challenges for TCKs and others who live cross-culturally, is our losses are very invisible, because nobody died. There were no divorces. There was no alcoholism. I was never abused. So I had this almost perfect life. And as I began to name the losses, then I can have choices. What am I going to do with it? What I found is when I'm having a feeling, I say, what am I feeling? And seeing if I can get a word for it. And then maybe, when did I feel like that before? It's kind of how I process now. But anyway, I was, as I began to understand that, then I began to realize I could make choices. When I realized that my anger when somebody's going to leave is really a defense against them leaving. Instead of withdrawing, I could say, hang on, and say to my friends, you know what, this is a way I do life too often. I don't want to do it that way. So if I start to do it, you call me, but it also helps me make a choice. I don't have to do it that way. I'm not locked in to my old patterns. And if I don't have language, if I don't have understanding, I'm just locked into responding and feeling. But I can't make a choice on how to change. And that's why, to me, it's really important to understand. And also some things like understanding I lost the world that I fit in. Okay, like I said before, I knew I fit in Nigeria very well. Then I got back to the States and I didn't. Well, is it because I'm crazy? It's not because I'm crazy. It's because I'm like anybody else. I learned to live in a culture that I grew up in, and I knew how to relate to different people. Now I'm in a different place, so I have to learn it again. It's not going to happen automatically. So instead of thinking, what's the problem with me, I can say, okay, this is how it is. Now what am I going to do about it? And for me, that's just been a huge thing. Changed my life.
Yeah, and I can understand how it really would be difficult to not be able to relate to that or not be able to understand that unless you really went through it yourself. And so for me, this is why we're here, to be able to share our stories, to be able to bridge that gap, for those who may maybe not be able to relate, but to also to be able to open up avenues for all of us to be able to express ourselves so that we can reach out, and hopefully those who are in the non-TCK community can reach out back to us. It's a two-way street, and we just really appreciate those who are tuned in today. Before we
I think that one of the things is, if I understand my issue of hidden loss, people of all backgrounds have hidden losses. And often they also struggle because they don't know what it was they lost beyond maybe the obvious. Maybe a child died, but what did you lose? Yes, you lost a child, but you lost the dream of the wedding. You lost the dream of the grandkids. There's things that go with the loss that we don't maybe stop to think. So I think that's also one of my most connecting places to people who are not TCKs. It's that the issue of losses in everybody's life, and how do we process. Back to you.
Michael, did you have anything to add?
Well, I had a lot of thoughts while I was going through, but I think that it's true. One of the things that occurs to me is just what Ruth was saying about the commonality of experiences. Because we're such a global society, and there's so much change. Just the fact of feeling out of place, of feeling like you're not understood, of people looking at you and making a judgment based on how you look, how you dress, perhaps your accent, and things that the hidden stories. And just, I think it's really a call to our humanity, to recognize in each other the stories, to never underestimate that each human being who walks into your life, your circle, has their unique story, carries their wounds and their losses, has strong potential, and so I think that's a great view in mind to keep as we talk specifically, about TCKs and understanding them, understanding ourselves, and who we are, and what we bring, and perhaps what that implies for what we do. What do we do with it? but that there's a common story, and the things that we learn, like Ruth was saying, are things that we can apply as we reach out to each other.
And that's a very important point, because what I do notice is that with the friendships I've made, through thirdculturekid.com and other venues, I noticed that we all have a special empathy. We all have that capacity to empathize with people who don't have any similarities with us whatsoever, because we grew up moving around so much that our countrymen and women were the world. The world was our countrymen and women, and in a sense we learned how to relate to one another outside the categories of race and class and nationality and religion even, and all sorts of categories that, in a sense, from what I observe, we're categoryless in a sense. And we really literally live in between worlds. We think in between worlds. We relate to one another in between worlds. We're in that middle place where we're very comfortable with gray areas. We're very comfortable with what the world might see as fence sitting, but yet that's where we are, and it's part of our valid identity. And so I believe that's where our gift is, to be able to relate from that place and be able to bridge people and bring gaps, instead of bridging gaps and just bringing people together, and pointing out, like you said, that human experience, that those commonalities, because in the end, and I know, Ruth, this is what you always say, we're first human. First we're human before we're even a TCK.
Absolutely. I was going to say, that's my experience. It's shaped me profoundly, but it isn't at the core of who I am. At the core of who I am is being a person who's relational and creative and emotional, just like everybody else in the world. And everybody in the world is shaped by their experience, their background. And the fact that we talk about this doesn't make us better than or so different from, but everybody, I think, needs to understand the way and process in which they were shaped by their story, by their experience. And when you do that, whatever story or background you're from, then you can use it. You have something that's you can use to reach out to other people, and that's why I work and do what I do, because I believe that we can use the gifts in new ways, and we can also work with others who may not have our story, but share our humanity.
And speaking of stories, Erin, do you have any stories or comments coming in from our audience? I know we have a little bit of a technical difficulty with adding the link to our tckid.com page, but I know that it will be there as a replay. And right now, hopefully all the people joining us are viewing us from our Facebook fan page. Erin, do you have anything coming in, or maybe any previous questions that apply to naming our losses, naming our experiences?
Absolutely. Actually, so we've started collecting questions and stories on our my.tckid social networking page from our followers over there. And we have a couple of comments about, having a name or having language for their experiences. We have one comment here from somebody named TT Hill. She says, I'm an ATCK, and I struggled with having an identity for a long time and still do. Since joining this TCK community, I found a language to articulate and relate to a lot of the struggles that I've had. I'm about to embark on a journey with my children that will expose them to being TCKs. And she wanted to ask, how do I help them work through or be confident in an identity? My parents were both diplomats, so I have 4 different cultures I identify with: Nigerian, Senegalese, American, and British. My husband is British, and my kids are mixed race. We are moving to Beijing, and I'm not feeling very confident about helping them with a sense of identity. I still find it hard to answer the question, where are you from? How do I help my children with this?
Well, I think, do I get to jump in?
Go for it.
The first thing about this story is we haven't even talked about one of the new things is increasing cultural complexity of so many who are growing up in today's world. I grew up between Nigeria and Chicago, okay, Illinois. So I had two worlds I navigated. Many of you have this multiplicity of worlds, and then your parents or your children, you know, the multiple cross-cultural marriages or partnerships, and it's just really becoming more complex, which is why what you're doing is so important. But I think maybe one of the challenges, are there new ways to think about identity? Because I think this is also why sometimes it's hard for academicians to believe there's perhaps a legitimate topic here, because it does do what you say, Myra. It moves past the typical boxes. I think for an awful lot of kids and for a lot of families, that's why it's so important that you build first a terrific family identity if you can, you know, where you have traditions that are your families, that are mobile. And then instead of working against the diversity and the difference, embracing that. And I think one of the other things I see a lot of families in this situation do is they develop and grow with their kids. Something my parents, I suppose, did intuitively. They gave me gifts from every place we've been. So I kind of had my world in a box, and if I went to college, I put up my stuff, and every house I've gone for all these years, I put up that group of stuff. And that kind of marks this now as both my background and my present, you know, and I think using the experiences when people are in different countries, not just ignoring that you're there, but really develop that uses the gifts of the experience, I think. But the big thing is, I think also allowing our children and ourselves to say, I can be more than one. Now, some people say that's not so. We do need a sense of belonging, but I have a bunch of places I feel very much that I belong to. I belong to my nuclear family. I belong, of course, with my children and so forth. But when I'm where my grandmother used to live, everything in me just says, this is it. When I get off a plane in Africa and I see the stars and the skies and all that, I think this is, you know, I belong here. Something's here. But I also believe that for me, I have come to understand I belong in this international expat lifestyle community. When I travel places and I speak at different places and I'm in that community, I don't know the people, but I know that life. And it feels like, yes, I understand what this life is like, and I belong. So I think we can find lots of belongings. For me, now other people, you may all have your own story, but you know, we are both a place that we have citizenship, but we can also belong in, I think, larger ways than maybe would be traditionally understood. That's how I feel. You can all say what you feel. See, I'm old now, so I can say what I want.
You earned that right.
Thanks. But I do feel at home. Maybe because I've come to feel at home in myself. I can feel at home. I don't have to prove anymore who I am. And I know that everybody won't understand my story, but I don't understand everybody else's story. You know, I can relate to them as a human, but I don't know what it's like to be my neighbor and go to Lucent Technology and, you know, be an engineer. I don't know what I don't know what it looks like. So why do I think he should know what my life? But we can be good friends. We can be good neighbors. But I don't know other people's worlds either. But I know the world I have, and I'm at home in it.
And I know that some of us, we have a different experience with language, because, for example, you can think of a concept in a certain language that may not have a translation in English. And so for those who grew up with different languages, in a sense, we had to find that thread, that wave level that isn't limited by language. And I think a lot of us try to communicate and understand one another even when there might not be a language there. And so what I notice for myself, I always try to scratch beyond the surface of what I see. And I've been called acutely analytical by people in grad school. But it's really from that place of, I know it's misunderstood a lot also, but it's just scratching beneath what I see, because there is something beyond language that humans connect to. And I think third culture kids are very sensitive to that wavelength. Michael, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just having come from trying to just and having some background with Africa, and just thinking about this family and the fact that it will be a big transition. That's the first thing is not to cover that over and say, well, it'll all be okay. It will be okay, but to take it seriously and be really intentional, I think is critical for everyone. What Ruth said about the family culture, even what a family does together in the preparation process for going overseas, and this is so specific to the question, but also general, adds to that bonding of the family. That we're going to look out for each other. We're going to take care of each person's need. One of the aspects of that transition process is the chaos, and the chaos leads us to our natural selfish tendencies to take care of myself. And so even things like that, to expect that to come and to kind of prepare ahead. If there's a kind of boot camp experience that a family can go to, sort of like a pre-field orientation, I know that there are quite a few available, not as many as there probably should be, but if not, there are a lot of books, a lot of resources, a lot of great authors. In the TCK book, which I just had to show, I had my original one with me today.
There you go.
That section on the raft and preparing, so critical to make sure that relationships where you are taken care of before you move to the next place. And sometimes it's not possible to make everything, to fix everything, but to walk into that place of reconciliation, to offer that, and to be able to start clean is so important. And then the rest of the raft has some really helpful aspects of things to do together as a family to prepare.
Such helpful information. Erin, is there any other comments coming in, maybe specifically about naming our losses, naming our experience?
We just have one more comment. This one is from Uta Limaker Nripo, also from our my.tckid website. She says that I notice that many parents who raise TCKs are not even aware that there is a name for them and that there are studies and articles about it. I don't like to categorize people, and I'm not aiming to do it, but I think that if people would be more aware of the ups and downs of a TCK life, many children, young people, and adults would struggle less. And so she wanted to know how we can raise awareness about TCKs among people who are starting life abroad with their children.
That's what your job is. I'm being a little facetious, but that's really absolutely right on, because it isn't about not doing this experience, it's about how to do it well. We're not going to stop it. We're living in the middle of a grand social experiment that has never been done before, and nobody's going to stop globalization, nobody's going to stop the high mobility, nobody's going to stop the cross-cultural stuff. So that's why I think, as Mike was saying, there's this key place, and as you were referring, Myra, to Ted Ward's comment, we've had this little petri dish to look at what does this experience do to people. How does it form it? How is it different from a traditional monocultural background? And then how are the things that we've learned, how can we apply them? One of them is making parents aware that this isn't the same way that they grew up. My mother grew up in Chicago, from day one. And after I started doing this, she said, until you started doing this stuff, I never thought that Chicago wasn't your home. Now, I'm thinking, Mother, where did I grow up? My whole life was in Africa. But I said, why were you surprised? She said, because Chicago's my home. So I think a lot of the parents don't really stop to think about cultural identity, how we form it, all these things. And they get very shaken when their kids don't seem to feel exactly like they felt or something. But anyway, I think social media is huge. I think that the corporations and the organizations that send people overseas have to keep realizing, and many are doing better. And, we started the Family and Global Transition Conference trying to improve that awareness, that if you're sending people overseas, you are responsible for helping prepare them. And certainly Dave Pollock was very big on that, calling for full of care, where there's a responsibility not just for the employee, but how do you prepare the whole family? Because this is different than hiring somebody to work in a local bank or something else, because the whole family is impacted when they take a global assignment. So I think that there's a huge amount of work to be done. There's a huge amount of work to be done with educators, because even those who aren't going overseas, they're coming to, you know, wherever local schools are. As I said, you guys have a big job. I'm going to cheer you on, but it's a big job, and it's absolutely needed, because it can be such a well. I think, you know, we all know that when you're not stuck in the challenges, unresolved grief, because people don't understand the story, is the biggest thing I see that's where people get stuck long term. And that sense of where do I belong is part of the grief. But when people become understanding that this is also a gift, it's a paradox, there's the struggle, but there are enormous benefits. We start to use them. And yesterday I got a doctoral dissertation from Patricia Stokey, and she has just finished it, and she did her work on the global mindedness of TCKs, and you know how this has prepared this group of people to be leaders and participants fully in a globally changing world. So the gifts are huge, and as parents understand that, how do they then help develop it? And part of that is dealing with the challenges effectively so that kids don't get stuck. And building the raft is probably one of the biggest things, that you just don't leave without saying goodbye. Because if you say goodbye, then you can say hello. If you don't say goodbye, you can't really say hello well. That was Dave's big line.
I love that. If you can't say goodbye, you can't really say hello. That makes
Absolutely.
a lot of sense. Michael, do you have anything to add?
I would. The thing that stood out to me in that, what the person sent in, was that the question about labels. I don't like to label people. I don't like to, you know, to mark them. And I think that's good and it's important. You know, even though there's still work to do with, there are a lot of folks who are TCKs and who don't know it. You know, I think there's a lot of work still there to do. But I think there are also, I've run into TCKs who say, you know, I'm tired of hearing that term. You know, please stop. Don't even talk to me about that. I don't want to hear that acronym. And what's important in that process is to say, you know, that yes, this is something that it does happen to you, but you participate in it. It's going to change your perceptions and of the world and culture and sense of identity, belonging. There will be issues of grief. There will be questions about purpose, and you know, what do I do with all of this? It's just one of the things I love to address. But that it does not supersede the person. The person remains the person. I think of this with my own kids, hearing from them. You know, I'm an individual. I'm me, and that's absolutely true. Each person is unique. I think it's what the label or the language does for people is also allows us to bring tools. One thing that I like to say to TCKs is you're not crazy and you're not alone. These things are that you walk through, you know, including sometimes depression and struggles and anger and different things that you might face. Those are pretty normal. It's okay. That's a part of, you know, can be just part of the process. The second thing I would say to a parent, which I've said many times to parents with the schools I work with in China, was you cannot stop your child from becoming a third culture kid. You've already made that decision. You brought them from Korea, from South Africa, from England, from, you know, Nigeria, U.S. to China. So now they're in between cultures. They're not going to become Chinese, and they're not going to remain exactly, you know, German or Korean or whatever. But what you can do is you can prevent them from taking hold of the advantages of being a third culture kid. You can keep them from making good friendships. You can keep them from language learning and things that you can keep them from experiences that would stretch them and help them gain, Myra, as you were saying, empathy, you know, for the viewpoint of the other. So those things, you know, that and I've seen that happen. And so to think about, yes, these are the challenges. Yes, these are the gifts of being a TCK, and to work on highlighting and bringing those gifts, you know, out in the time abroad I think, really important.
That's such an important point. I know that because if we don't recognize a part of our identity, it does rob us of the gifts that come with that identity and that life experience. I just received word that the link was now posted on TCKid.com, and for those just tuning in on TCKid.com, thank you for your patience. We just had some technical difficulty, and we have been live on our Facebook fan page, and I'm glad that you could join us on TCKid.com now. At this time, we want to transition to letters never sent, and there are such raw pieces of story there. There's a lot of pages that really talk about that raw human experience with pain and loss and grief, and I will touch on a few of them with Ruth. But before we go into that, Michael, I want to talk about what your father said in the foreword for this book. And I know this book played a big role in how Ruth and Dave became friends and what evolved out of that friendship, which is the Third Culture Kid book. But in the foreword, he says, you know, and he was talking about how a 40-year-old man went up to him and very emotionally said, "Where was all this information? Why wasn't someone there to help me 20 years ago?" And so Dave Pollock, in his response, he said his inward response to this question was, "We can't answer for 20 years ago, but by God's grace, no TCK will have to ask that question 20 years from now." And this was, I'm estimating 1987, 1988.
Right.
You might have written
87.
this forward. 87. Michael,
Right.
do you have any words about how your father today might see things in relation to his comment, and how do you see things?
Myra, that's a great question. I think there's an experience that I had in China, which was about 20 years past that, where I was sharing the TCK model with parents at a school in Wuhan, and I had a group of Korean parents. We were doing Chinese and Korean translation, so it took longer. It was great. But at the end, a man in his 50s came up to me, a Korean man, and just was really excited. He said, "Today, I learned I am a TCK," and then told me his story. And I said, there's a lot, there's a lot there to discover. And so in some ways, I thought, wow, 20 years on, there's still a lot of work to be done, let's say. But what I'm encouraged about, and this goes back to thanking you, Myra, and Aaron, and Bryce, and others who have, looked at the tools of modern communications and the world beyond airforms, and really begin to use that to broadcast, to communicate, to share. And I think that, like Gladwell might say, I think that we're coming closer to a tipping point where it becomes, sort of of course, our planet is in transition all the time. People are always moving. These things make sense. And as Ruth said, there's that global cross or intercultural complexity that keeps increasing. The stories are so, it takes to just kind of unravel the threads. It take somebody an hour. This is my story. And so I think that that we are moving toward in the right direction, and there's a lot happening. And I'm really grateful for folks who know how to take hold of the technology and use it. 10 years ago was the wireless revolution. 5 years ago, kind of the smartphones. I mean, the speed with which we can communicate and share ideas now is amazing. I think that where I see it going, there's still the question of there's a big question, and one that I hope other colleagues will join me in answering, is this question of what do I do with if for those who do know, okay, I have this TCK background. It gives me a name. It gives me some tools. It gives me some help. So what do I do with it? Myra, I was writing back and forth with you that if I were to write a book, which would probably do, I'd love to do with a group, is on that topic. Okay, so now I get it. Now what do I do? And I think that's an exciting question to be asking.
That's TCKid Phase 2.
And that is what we are developing. And it's interesting
Absolutely.
how the timing of it is coming all together, because Erin and I agreed that part of what we will be developing as a platform on TCKid.com is to develop a platform that we're going to call TCKid Connect. And it's a platform where TCKs who are in that stage of what now? You know, what do we do now? I know who I am. I know how to navigate my identity and my life experience. And I know what my gifts are, and I can fine-tune it now to be able to give it back to the world. And so that's what the platform will be for. It's for TCKs to be able to go on TCKid.com in a central location and find a network of opportunities where they can apply their unique gifts and skills. And it's also a platform for others, you know, from different sectors of the public to be able to go on TCKid.com to easily find TCKs who are available with their time and skills to be involved in their organization or business. And so when we relate back to these resources in these books, they play an important role, because without knowing who you are or why you are, or without the skills to navigate your past experience, we believe that you can't really get to that spot of being able to fine-tune your skills, and because it involves understanding who you are. And I believe, Ruth, this book says it too, that when you're able to understand more of yourself, then you're able to help others, you know, and anything you put your effort to, because you're able to, like what we said, what we've been saying is that if you can't understand your identity completely, you also miss out on your gifts that you have to offer to the world. And so that's what we're moving into now, and it seems that we're all sort of moving in the same direction around the same time, and it's really exciting that way. And back to Letters Never Sent, there's specific pages in here that are very raw, Ruth, and I was talking, Erin and I were talking to a friend, and she was sharing that she's been actually scared to read it because the first page itself is so emotional, but for anyone up to the challenge of reading it, you know, when you have time, because it is very emotional, but it also, it's a process of us being able to share that journey, that anyone who reads it will be helped themselves. I know that it helped me in my relationship with my parents, because I grew up and I couldn't help it, but I had a lot of resentment towards the host country that sent us to different countries, sometimes at an inopportune time, sometimes even in the middle of a school year. And I developed resentment as a childhood, and I had to find a way to process that. And reading this book helped me in that process, and helped me in the process of resolving my resentment towards my parents, because in a way I also had to recognize my father as a third culture kid. He's second generation third culture kid, and seeing it through that lens that, you know, my parents, you know, my mom is a third culture adult, my father is a second generation, you know, foreign service diplomat, and he's also a third culture kid. Being able to understand other people's experiences, you know, maybe they didn't have the resources to name it at that time, but being able to understand that I could name their experience from my experience, you know, from my perspective, really helped me along the way. And so this is why I'm going to dig now into those very emotional chapters. And for those who are listening in, you know, we just invite you to welcome and listen to our stories. But Ruth, in your introduction, you mentioned earlier that you had this anger that you know wouldn't go away. In your introduction, you said, under the appearance of perfection hid a person given to depression, anger, and a spirit of criticism. No amount of praying made it better. Sometimes things improved for a while, but soon everything was as before. But then you also heard the words, and then you said, everyone alive has hidden griefs, ones unrecognized even to themselves. And then you heard the words, "Let me take you back so you can see just what yours are." And you heard, "Don't be afraid to hold my hand and face all of your past. Yes, there will be tears as you remember some events. Opening up old wounds can be painful, but you can trust me. I'll be as gentle as possible. I want you healed." Ruth, can you share a bit about that part of your journey when you heard these words?
I can, and thank you for asking me. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that publicly before, and so I'm happy to explain it. I also wanted to just say, before I do that, I don't know if you can see this, but there is a new version that's just come out, let's see, this way. Joe Parfit asked me to write a new epilogue. Everything's the same except the epilogue, what happened for the last 30 years since I wrote it. So if anybody's interested, that's now online. That was a huge time for me because I was living in Liberia, as I said before. Our daughter, was going to go back to the States a few months before us, because if you don't have language, you also can't stop, I would say, some mistakes. I would never let her go back and do reentry without me, but I didn't have understanding, and I just thought, oh, I made it, So she was going to go. I was having all these same type of experiences and feelings, and I found this is deeper than her leaving. Of course, I'm sad that she's leaving. And so that was this process of trying to understand. And my story, as you said, my parents were in missions. I want to give them also thanks because, like other people I've heard, my parents walked the talk that they. So I grew up with a tremendous heritage, I think, of faith and trust. And yet I had it. That was even part of the reason I couldn't process it, because it felt like if I was going to process anything painful, I would be negating my parents. I would be negating my faith. I think military kids can feel like if they say that something's wrong, they're saying, that the military isn't good. Or for those of you in foreign service, you can't say some of the things now you said that I was resentful to the people that sent my parents, because it feels like you're being disloyal. I don't know, but that was for me. I felt like I was being disloyal. So being able to live in paradox was an enormous thing. To understand that you can live in both, for me, both pain and faith had been a huge issue. There were no therapists in Liberia, and I think it's probably a good thing, because I've talked to so many who've gone to therapists who could only think about these things in terms of their traditional training. They didn't understand this invisible world, nor did I. And so there was this world I needed to explore, and the only way I could do it was with writing. So, and it was scary, because the reason we put aside our grief is because it's painful. And as I've said many times, grief is really a sign of the good, because if I hadn't loved Africa, if I hadn't loved my family, I wouldn't have missed them. So grief is not a negative emotion, but it's a scary emotion, because you don't know if you'll ever come out again. And that's why I had to hear those words, "I'll be with you," that I wasn't going to do this alone. And I think in the mystery of time, sometimes it's like a pause button can go on our childhood or these events in the past, because when I was 6 years old, I couldn't process grief. I could only survive it. So the first day that I decided, my family went to sleep, and I picked up my pencil and I wrote those first words, "Dear Mom and Dad, today I left." I was suddenly that child again in my first grade room. And I was overwhelmed, absolutely overwhelmed, because I felt everything I felt before. My chest was tight.
And we may be going through some technical difficulty. Aaron, do you see?
I was silent, but I'm going to. Do you need to stop?
Can you repeat the maybe last 2 minutes?
Okay. What I was saying is, when I started and I picked up my pen and I wrote, "Dear Mom and Dad," suddenly, experientially, I was that child in my 6-year-old first night at boarding school, where the lights are turned out and my mommy's not there. And the pain of it was just excruciating, even though I was 39. And so I cried. But the process of writing letters was trying now, as I was re-experiencing some things, to put language on it. And not to stop the tears, but to grab the language to try and explain. It was sort of like I had this adult self trying to write, what the child was feeling. Now, people say to me, how did you remember? I said, I didn't remember, I re-experienced. But one person said to me, I think very insightfully, she said, no, you didn't re-experience it. You let yourself experience it for the first time. Because when you were a child, the only thing you could do was try to stop the pain. And after a while, the whole issue of attachment and detachment, you have to detach if you have too much pain. And I think what people don't understand is when a child is making some of these really significant moves, or we're losing so many different relationships, it's not just one time. It's, as you said, it's chronic. If it's not me leaving, it's somebody else leaving. And I remember even, the first other adult that I just thought was wonderful, wonderful when I was 5, and they were going to get transferred to a different country, and I wept and I wept, and I just couldn't believe they were going. Because you as a child don't know that life will go on, this is your world. So as I did letters, what I was really doing, I wasn't writing a book, I was in fact journaling, and I was trying to name what these losses were, because I didn't have language. But to do that, I had to let myself go back and be in the moment, and it's almost like I'd start to write, and then I would be in that moment, and then I'm trying to grab whatever that feeling was. And before I came to leaving Nigeria, I put it away. I thought, oh, this is really stupid. This is dumb. I didn't even know what I was really feeling. It's, what am I doing here? And then I thought, well, I'm going to just talk about leaving one day. And then when I started to write about leaving Nigeria, for the first time I realized that was the day my world died. Because I never had those trees to climb again. I never saw those friends again. But theoretically, it wasn't my world. And so we had no funerals. That was the process. We didn't have a raft to build. We just left. Now, I want to say one other thing, and then you can go back and ask me more. A critical piece in the middle of writing letters was that when I sent this to Dave Pollock, when I got that survey, and I said, I'm writing these things, maybe it'll help you with your conference, or understanding that even when you're an adult, these things don't go away. Or maybe I said I'm the only one. Well, he wrote back and he said, no, you're not the only one. But he sent me a letter from a therapist that he had written, Sharon Wilmer. And he'd said to her she did a lot of work with missionary kids, but she was also a military kid herself. And he said, what are the main issues that you see in this population? And she said, a lack of comfort and a lack of a sense of personhood. Well, I didn't know what personhood meant then. I've come to understand, do a lot of work with that now. But the word comfort overwhelmed me. I thought I was encouraged to death, but I wasn't comforted. Because part of the sad thing for so many of us is the very effort people make to help us is all about, well, just think about, if I was at boarding school, well, think about all the kids, their mommies, they don't even have a mommy, okay? So at least your mommy's alive. Well, that's really nice. But what does that do for me? It gives no permission to deal with the pain, because I should be happy. And just think about, well, I always, and so you have no permission, but nobody came and said, it's really okay to miss your mommy. And I was talking to somebody once, and they were just found out they were going to move again. And they said, well, our kids had such a hard time last time that we're not even going to tell them. We're just going to send them on a trip. We're going to move and then take them back to the new place. And, oh, my heavens, please don't do that, because kids have to process it as it happens. And I think people don't think kids either need to do that or that they will get through it. And so that grief is very scary to the parent who's already feeling guilty, or to the teacher. So people are well-meaning. But that was the biggest thing, I think, in doing that I found a huge difference between comfort and encouragement. And that was when I thought, no, that was the word I was writing about, that I was looking for comfort. And all the people who were more than well-meaning, I'm not faulting anybody, but they tried to help by encouraging me, to get you through it, instead of just stopping them and say, it's hard. So that's another big thing I learned in that process.
And that process is hard when you're a child, and what you're going through is it's impossible. When you're going through that much grief as a child and no one recognizes it, why would anyone have a reason to give you comfort? And also, why would anyone ever think that you would need validation for what you're going through as a child? I remember those years of separating, being separated from my parents, and part of the Filipino culture, and this is why I never considered myself completely just Filipino or Filipino American, because I think a lot of us can relate to that experience of we're not just another immigrant, in this country. Part of what made it hard for me in the Filipino culture, and like you, Ruth, I'm not blaming a culture or demonizing a culture, but we have that habit, maybe in many Asian American cultures or Asian cultures, of saving face and saying, stop the crying, we're here, and not harshly, but it's part of the culture, stop the crying, and just move on, sort of, and be happy, and I know Erin's laughing, but if you translate it, the double language is minimizing, using double words in the Filipino language is minimizing what you're doing. So, sangit, in Ilocano, it's crying, and stop that. And it's very, very hard, and that's what I'm hoping today, that this interview would also reach the ears of those counselors and anyone working with children who might not recognize that they're working with third culture kids. And Ruth, I want to dig into a few sections in the book that I believe a lot of us can relate to, and give you a chance to comment on those. What a lot of people don't realize outside the non-TCK or CCK community, and for those just tuning in, third culture and cross-cultural kid community, is the first day of school for those with global lifestyles looks very different from someone who's dropping off their kid at the kindergarten for their first day of school, where for someone who goes to a local kindergarten, and it is very hard. I know it's a parent experience, a human experience that we all can relate to. But for those with global lifestyle, there's an added layer to that. And let me just read what Ruth wrote as part of her first day of school, if I'm understanding correctly, Ruth.
Right.
It says here, this is the very first chapter. September 1951. Dear Mom and Dad, I feel awful. Something inside is squeezing me so bad I can hardly breathe. You said it would be fun to get on the plane and go to boarding school, but so far it isn't. I couldn't stop crying on the airplane, but I didn't want the other kids to know. I kept my face to the window so they might think I liked watching the clouds. And that was part of your first day, part of your introduction to that boarding school. And jumping to college years, September 1963. Dear Mom and Dad, here I am at college. How did I get to be so old? It's nice here in the dorm, but I can't believe how homesick most of the freshmen are. They run to call their parents every other night, and they all talk about how much they miss home. It seems so silly. But once in a while I wonder what is stranger, to be all of 18 and still missing Mom and Dad, or to be only 18 and not feeling homesick at all. So that was college years. And then now we go to the loss of your grandmother. April 1967. I love Grandma so much after living with her these last 7 years. Couldn't she at least have seen me married? The finality of her going is still incomprehensible. I feel a lot like I did the day you first left me for 4 years. And then July 1967, you're talking about your husband here. I can't believe God will let me keep David. It's like he's dangling Dave on a rope, letting him come closer and closer. I'm afraid that at the last moment, when I reach out my hand to take him, The string will be jerked back, and God will laugh. Ruth, what would you like to share about those sections?
Well, I have to get past emotion here. It's funny how things last for a long time, isn't it? And I really appreciate how you put that together. I haven't thought about it in cohesion like that for a long time. But see, that's what I'm talking about, how life and experiences affect you. And you have to understand, in all those years, I had no language, okay? So all I'm wondering is what's going on. So as I was mentioning before, we do wind up detaching from emotion because we don't really have a choice if the emotion is too bad. In fact, Doug Ota's writing a book on transition, and he's talking about if we talked about grief in terms of attachment and loss in those ways, maybe it would be a more acceptable term. But obviously, one of the huge issues, I know most TCKs don't go to boarding school at 6 anymore, but a lot in my generation did, so they're still part of the story. But when you have a chronic cycle of separation and loss going on, what happens is eventually you learn how to cut it off because it's too much. And this is where we have these huge issues, I think, later on with relationships. And that was what happened to me. First, I'm mad at my roommate and said, hey, what's your problem? You know, don't be such a baby. Well, what am I saying? I've pushed away the reality that it's actually okay to like your family and to need them. I hadn't seen my parents for 4 years, so I mean, why would I miss them? It was, even in fact, when I wrote letters, I never realized it was the death of my family when they left for 4 years until I was 39. And I cried as if I'd gotten a car, response. I mean, I noticed that they just all been killed in a car accident. But then if you move forward, okay, so then my grandma's replaying something because I've been with her. Now I'm going to lose her again. So the reality that I never, ever get to keep, well, in a way that's a reality for everybody because that's life. But we do it chronically. And so how do you live in a relationship? And I think one of the things that was, didn't have language. I could not understand when I got married to this wonderful man who loved me and was very good to me. Every time we really got close, I'd fuss about something. I'd fuss about the garbage. I mean, like, hello. And it was like, I was terrified. I wanted to be close, but like 95%. Because if I got all the way close, I couldn't bear it if he was gone. And so, again, that's why it's important to name your losses, because then I have to make choices. Am I going to lose my whole life with this person by fear? Or am I going to live as best I can and as well as I can, and when the loss comes, to live with that? My father, as you mentioned earlier, was another adult TCK who had no language before he died. He died without ever knowing that. But you see, he was the one that said to me, Ruth, unpack your bag and plant your trees, because when you start to live in all these places, you're never going to live if every place you go you don't unpack your bags mentally and physically, and you live there, and when the time comes to move, then you move. They said plant fruit trees, and he planted fruit trees. And when I went back to Africa, I went back and I saw the trees. He said somebody else will eat from them if you don't, but don't be afraid to plant. Don't be afraid to live. And so, I think that was when I got married. It was that fear that if I really invest everything, I've been married 46 years here, and I'm working on, daring to hope it will last. But really, that's again why understanding we can make choices. So that was the thread, that this place of preparing to protect against pain was robbing me in my life of other wonderful relationships because of fear. And I think that that's not uncommon. And so we can be independent and be proud of that, and it's a good thing, but then we isolate sometimes from other people. And I have to tell you, I've met a lot of TCKs that I feel like I can tap around them, but I can't get in because they've gotten so protected against pain and loss. And if you're one of them, I want to tell you there's a better way to live, and that's engaging and living fully and daring to be in these relationships that are given to us, and you'll feel a lot better, even if they get lost, if you've lived in them fully than if you've not lived in them halfway, because there's other parts of my book Oh, I just heard a recent song by John Denver about saying goodbye, and he says, "Why do I always get mad before we say goodbye," or something? And I thought that, you know, he's a TCK too. That once I realized that, because when you're getting mad to protect, well, before my parents left, I was just terrible for the, you know, before they left for 4 years. Then they get on the plane and you feel absolutely awful because you have no way to make it up then. And so I think that's another huge thing for me, is learning the patterns I had of isolating and realizing I could make a choice. Part of being a person is being able to make choices, and we are not victims, and we can make choices as adults and so forth. Does that help?
That's beautiful. And I remember when you were on Dr. Bethel's interview, you quoted a song sung by Garth Brooks. I can't remember off the top of my head the name of the writer of the song now. But
The Dance.
The Dance. And that song also played a special part in my heart because, like what you mentioned, it does talk about taking the risks. And I think that's also why we vibe so well with that TED Talk by Brene Brown on vulnerability and the power of vulnerability. And I know some of the TCKs out there listening have already heard that talk, but it goes along that same message that go ahead and live your life as if you're going to get hurt, knowing you're going to get hurt, because if you don't live, then you miss out on so much. Michael, do you have anything to add?
Go ahead,
Ruth.
Well, I was just thinking, somebody gave me a poster once, and it said, a ship is safe, but that's not what ships were made for. I want to bear witness that as I have made these choices, been able to look at these things, you know, it's painful at the time, but honestly, the life I've been able to enjoy and live from that has just been beyond mind-boggling. And I was in Afghanistan 2 years ago doing something, and I don't know, there were a whole lot of things happening, and it was the middle of the night, and I just thought, you know what, I was born to do this. I think the people that I live around in Indianapolis will think this is crazy, but everything in me was made to do this because of my life, because of my birth, because of how I was made, and it's just been a fabulous life that I wouldn't have missed, but I could have missed it if I tried to stay safe.
And
So I'm good. Michael?
Mara, what's your question?
Did you have anything to add?
I think, you know, as Ruth was sharing about this, you know, the process of grief and care. One thing that stood out to me is kind of where we are now in our learning process, and is that and how my dad might respond to it. And again, later I'll have more time to go into it. Just briefly, I think that there are lots of people who who think my dad actually was a sociologist. Dave actually has his doctorate from Houghton College. Is given a doctor of pedagogy, but mostly he was a practitioner, and his base for that was a pastor. And I think it's that pastor's heart, that compassion, that led to, you know, the listening and to be able to, as Ruth said, to take people's stories and to synthesize them and to find the connections. And there are three things that he emphasized about the care of TCKs. Like, why should we invest? Why should we care? And I wanted to, do have time to hit those just really fast?
Sure.
One, the main one, he says, because we exist, because there's a group of people with a kind of a common experience and challenges within that and potential within that, and so just the fact that we're here means, and I think Ruth alluded to this too, about because there are corporations and the military complex and and missions and sending families over. Well, we are creating TCKs, and so in that sense, then to be human is to care for them. I'll throw out a quick number I just saw. There are currently 3 million, over 3 million students in international schools around the globe, and that number is growing exponentially. It's a huge, we're talking about a pretty huge people group, and that doesn't count all the people who've come through international schools or homeschooled, etc. So it's a large group. The second thing, the second thing that my dad wrote, I picked this up in a couple writings, and that he would say was that to act on behalf of another human being for their good and to demonstrate what God is like is true love. And he believed that was our universal calling. That's the second important reason. It's really out of love that we care for people, to act on behalf of them for their good. And the third was this idea of, with those challenges, that we step alongside with care and comfort. I love that word, Ruth. It's maybe got me rethinking a couple of things I've been writing recently. But that alongside that encouragement and comfort that come together is the recognition of potential. That and we've mentioned this earlier, and so I won't spend a lot of time there. But Frederick Buechner, I love his quote about the places of the world's great need. Calling is where our deep gladness and the world's hunger, meet in the world's deep need. And I do believe we're in a time when people with, I would say, cross-cultural capital is what I would call it, and there's that compassion, that empathy, that understanding, that openness, that learner's attitude, server and the learner. It's what our times need. It's what our global community needs, and I believe there's terrific potential there. So I think that to begin with our own story, and to then to move from there with that message of healing, with that message of love and power, is one that's is what we're given. It's maybe what Ruth referred to as step 2.
Wow. And for us, that is what we hope to do. All of us are here today, and not just us, the 4 of us here, but our live audience tuning in, trying to be patient through any technical difficulties they may be facing, and just, being here gathered together, and whether they tune in live or afterwards. And it's really because of the work of your father, Michael, and we wouldn't all be here if it wasn't for him. And I just want to relay my thanks for you and your lives, and the gifts that you do share with us, because really there wouldn't be any motion, there wouldn't be any progress if we all just sort of looked out for ourselves, or stayed in our own process of in our own journeys without sharing it with the world. And that's why I want to encourage anyone out there also listening and watching to share your story also. And in a little while, we're going to be looking through any additional questions or comments that people who just joined in, maybe on TCKid.com, or maybe they have been watching us live from our Facebook fan page. But before we do that, we do have some announcements, and it is that we will be starting TCKid Connect, which we described earlier, a platform where TCKs can come on and find opportunities to apply their skills as a result of being able to know themselves and understand themselves better, and therefore being able to fine-tune their skills better. And also this TCKid Talks interview series is actually part of a long series that we hope to continue with your support, and we will be inviting people who TCKs and CCKs who are in leadership positions, those who have something to share that is very educational and informative, including researchers, authors, and lecturers. And we'll also be inviting artists, including musicians, performance artists. And also, we will be inviting and asking stories from people who were involved in some way in a historical event, whether the world knows it or not. And Aaron, are there any additional questions or comments from our live audience?
So far I am not seeing any, but we have plenty of questions on our my.TCKid website. Plenty of them, actually. So should I just go ahead and start reading some of these?
Sure, and before we do that, I just want to remind you that to stay tuned till the end, because we do have a special request from our audience to help move this journey forward for the rest of the world. Erin?
Yep. All right. So we have quite a bit of questions coming from my TCKid. We have one here from Beverly Mead, who says, I'm getting counseling this week for pretty much how to adapt when called to stay in a place going on 20 years now. Kids are almost out of the nest, and I'm part of a biblical sending church, where now I'm the one who gets left behind. So my question would be, how do you stay and form friendships and deal with the very real possibility that they will leave and possibly even not even keep in touch and don't even want to try anymore? So how do you deal with, people leaving, and how do you maintain your friendships? Does anyone want to answer that?
I'll give it a stab. I think sometimes we have a different way of doing friendships that's sort of normal, and everybody doesn't understand it, but we can be really involved, and when somebody goes away, we may not keep absolute close touch, but if I ever see him again, I'm just starting like I never said goodbye. And I think that it isn't maybe the way people have always done it, but it's a way that we understand. And so again, I'm back to, you can live your whole life and never dare involve. I met one girl who said, after she said goodbye and went into high school, wherever she did, she decided she wouldn't make any friends so that she would never have to say goodbye again. Well, that's called 4 years of loneliness, which of course she recognizes now. So my feeling is, I want to engage with everybody I meet the best I can. I want to learn from them. I want to be involved with them. If we have to say goodbye, nobody can ever take away what I've gained and what I hope is in their lives. And when we meet again, which often is a surprise, and we do meet again, we remember, we keep going. And if not, nobody can take out of my life what I've gained. And every piece and every person I meet is another brick that forms and gives me more strength and gives me more awareness. And that's my theory, but it may not be somebody else's. But I think I had to come to the place of saying that, well, that's another thing about knowing you can grieve, is that if I say goodbye, there's a process I can go through, and I will make it, but I don't want to lose what I can gain. That's me.
I would agree with that and just affirm that. I think that the amount of pain in goodbyes, in some ways it can become less over time, but not necessarily. Can still be surprised and be fresh. But that I think goes back to what we were saying earlier. When it's not compounded, when you've dealt with the grief that's come before, it is easier. And there's even for me there's a sweetness in that, like that. Oh, it's actually hard to say goodbye. That means that we had something important. Some of mine is still quite fresh, being back in the States for 9 years in a community in China, and so that's emotive, for me. Now the other side of this, we can stay in touch more than we could, 10, 15, 20 years ago, and I have a harder time trying to work out how much should I stay in touch. My children even more so. Should I Skype? Should I Facebook? Well, if I do that with all the people I've said goodbye to, then how do I have time and space to make friends in this community? And I would just add one more thing. When you're the one who stays, and everybody else is leaving, the thing that came to mind was just that the places of intentionality, saying, hey, if this happens, if this comes, how should we do this? Do you want to have some Skype conversations? We like to encourage you and support you while you're wherever, and so not taking it for granted, but being very, very intentional about we'd like to keep in touch. Is this good? Does this work for everyone? And how will we do it?
Excellent. We would love to be able to take everyone's questions, but I know in the interest of time, we are almost close near the end. And Aaron, maybe is there a quick question or comment before we close? And then Ruth and Michael, I want to ask you if there's any final words of advice that you have before we close. And for the rest of the audience, I know that we didn't get to all your questions, and maybe you did have questions you wanted to ask that you weren't able to ask because of the technical difficulty. But we also want to invite you to continue these discussions on tckid.com. We have the discussion boards, and we will be posting a discussion board, especially as a follow-up to this interview. Aaron, is there a quick question or comment that we can share?
Well, I'll close out our discussion. I just wanted to read some feedback that we got on our Facebook groups about today's live chat. Since this is our first episode of TCKid Talks, we're just sort of getting some feedback about what we've been talking about today. We have a comment from Paul Trigg here on our Facebook page, and he just wanted to say, I think many TCKs struggle with the issue of home as they struggle knowing who they are. We often get our identity from where we live and who we live with, but if that changes often, we not only lose our sense of having a home, but perhaps also struggle with a sense of identity too. Perhaps this is why we find it a relief relating to fellow TCKs, or a sense of liberty in realizing we have an identity as a TCK. It was a relief I could be happy being who I am without trying to be what others expect me to be, or try and be something I'm not. And then he also said that Ruth should definitely write a book about TCKs and relationships.
Thanks, Paul.
We have an assignment.
I love what you said, Paul. Absolutely true. Absolutely true. Besides the book, but what you say. Thank you so much.
Sure. And one last comment from Janae Robinson in our post with the TC Kids Illinois group. She says that fear is our protection when one has lived in many worlds and understanding has not been received. The gift of engagement is crucial. To live is worth the risk of getting hurt. Thank you, Ruth, and everyone.
Thank you. Any final words of advice?
Well, I'll just say thank you to the whole community, because my life has been incredibly enriched by all the people who've shared with me through the years, and just these couple of comments or the ones earlier, I think are part of the affirmation process that we're not alone. But I wanted to make one last encouraging thing for all of you. I keep telling you, your generation has to, move on now and build on what's been and look at the current things. And sometimes it's a little overwhelming to think, well, who am I? Well, I want to tell you that way back, thousands of years ago it feels like, but back even before I did letters, I had this sense I was supposed to write or do something. I didn't know what I was supposed to do, and I didn't even know what I was supposed to do it about exactly. And I asked somebody who had been a writer and blah, 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 and I said, now, how'd you do it? She looked at me. She said, Ruth, when you don't know how to do everything, ask what's the one thing you can do that's in front of your face right now. She said, you may never write a book, you may never do, anything big from what you look at it, but you get letters from people. You can write letters. You can talk to people. And if, that's what it is, that's fine, because you've encouraged those people. She said, but you'll be surprised if you keep doing one next thing, what will happen. And yesterday I was listening to Killian Kroll talk about FIGT on Paulette's telecom thing. And I remembered sitting at this kitchen table that I'm sitting at this very minute with my 3 friends thinking, what could we do? And it was the craziest idea in the world to try and have a little seminar. But we called Dave Pollock. We said, hey, could you ever come? Well, he said he could come. Okay, well, then what's the next thing? Could we get a place? And I was listening, and I thought, Joe Briscoe is right, that you'll never know what might happen if you keep waiting till you know it beforehand. You just get started. So for all of those of you, whether it's Bryce or you guys doing it now or whatever is going to be ahead, just start. And dare to believe that your life also has a purpose and a meaning, and that if you do those pieces and then you join together, it's incredible what has happened and is happening. And I'm only sorry that Dave Pollock didn't live to see you know, the extent of it now, but still, what's going to be ahead is great. So we need you all, and don't disaffirm your gifts. And you know, another book just came out, Lois Bouchon, which she wrote for therapists, and so now there's a resource for therapists in terms of how to deal with TCKs. And I mean, it just keeps growing. So please do your little part, and don't ever minimize the piece you've been given. And you might be as surprised as I am that a life you thought was in your way turned out to be your greatest gift.
Mm. And Michael, you know, to let you know, we will be having a separate interview with Michael and what he's doing with Daraja. And Michael, any last words or advice?
You almost said famous last words.
I know.
I don't know what's going to happen next, but Ruth, I'll take what Ruth just said as a segue. You know, my wife and I and our kids were in China for 9 years, and just began to see. I was doing spiritual formation and student development there with 6 schools, and directing after being an elementary principal. But we began to see a need for a time in that emerging adulthood, those years, 17 to 21, 22, and just began to ask, yeah, what role do we have in that? What exists for TCKs, for people walking through? And I just think when I see groups like Sea Change, Ellen Mahoney, and groups, I get really excited because I do believe that one of our roles as older TCKs is to reach back and mentor and support you know, those who are moving up. But when we found that there wasn't really a lot in those college years for TCKs, we said, well, perhaps this is our one little thing, you know, to begin to do. And so that was the beginning of Daraja, and it does mean bridge, and it is an intentional work to provide a gap semester or gap year experience for TCKs in between high school and the end of college. And all about developing cross-cultural initiative, leadership, understanding your gifts. How do I apply them? How do I come out with a plan? When my world is not very stable at times during those years, how do I formulate a strong, concrete and flexible plan to go forward? And so we're looking forward to that. We are opening up from February to May, our first cohort, and excited about what will come.
So interesting. And we also look forward to interviewing with you individually later on.
Great.
At this time, I'd like to announce our special request for our live audience and our audience after this live broadcast. And you know, we're doing this because we really want to put the resources available for TCKs more to the forefront and bring it more to the forefront, more in the mainstream. And so what we're asking everyone who is watching to do this, and also ask 10 friends to please go to your local library and different libraries, as well as your bookstores that you have access to, and simply request for the Third Culture Kid Growing Up Among Worlds book to be available, as well as the Letters Never Sent to be available and be made available at your local library and at your bookstore. Because from what I gather, it's not readily available. It can be special ordered, but it's not on the bookshelves yet. So if we all, in the next 30 days, and then continue on in the next 90 days or 3 months, to just request it, and request it, and request it, and ask your friends to request it. And hopefully that we will show that there is a need for these resources out there, that it is something that many of us need, and not just a fringe, you know, because one of the issues that we're dealing with marginalization here. So if we all just, you know, as a concerted effort, as united effort, just request these resources to be made available, then I believe we can make an impact. And as we close, I just want to say my thank yous. I want to say a thank you to Michelle Millon, who helped us with the practice of the live broadcast. She's she's working with Mosaic Conference, and you can find more information about Mosaic Conference on mosaicconference.com with a K, M-O-S-A-I-K, conference.com. And we also like to say thank you to Claire Miranda, who is a longtime volunteer with TCKid and also a mentor with Sea Change Mentoring. And we also want to say thank you to Mina Demian, who has his company called Median Holdings. And Aaron, do you have any parting words for us also?
Well, we just wanted to say thank you to both Ruth and Mike for joining us today and for dedicating so much of their time to talk, not just talking to us, but to our entire community about, all of these things. Even though, we talk about TCKid all the time, or like we talk about it within our community, I personally feel like I never get sick of talking about it. So just being able to have such an excellent opportunity to talk about this with both of you and to share this with our community is just, to me, it's overwhelming. And I, even just my own friends who are messaging me right now are all really excited about revisiting this video. So I really am very excited about, doing this in the future. And, thank you both very much for being a part of it and for helping us launch it.
Thank you very much.
I have to say, we couldn't do it without you. That's what it's all about. Because if you're waiting for me to do technology, we're back to airports, and tape content. So I am so appreciative of what you all do to make the message known, and it couldn't happen without you. And that's just phenomenal to me that you are doing this and you're able to do it and you're doing it so well. So thank you, and thank you to all she mentioned and all of those who have listened in, and love to hear from you. My website is www.crossculturalkid.org, and you can write me there if anybody wants to. But I'll be on your TCKid. I'll be following that here for a bit on your discussion. If that's okay.
Thank you.
And I'd love to engage with you there.
Well, yeah,
Okay?
We'll continue these discussions on tckid.com.
I'll
And
be there.
I believe you can find more information on Daraja at, is it at a Facebook page, or do you have also a website, Michael?
Yeah, the website is www.daraja, D-A-R-A-J-A.co, and we have a Facebook page under Daraja TCK.
Awesome. Well, this is Myra and Aaron signing off TCKid TV. We just reminding you to smile because you have a tribe, and reminding you to share your stories. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.